Again, welcome those who are here in the flesh, and welcome to you who are online. Appreciate it. I think we had like 16 or something online last week. Damien, have you seen your Deuteronomy test? Did I send it to you? I can't remember. Did I? Okay. I see we have some notes in the back room there in case you hadn't noticed. My notes are just a continuation from one page to another other than the space in between to start a new document. It just makes it easier than keeping them all together. But basically, they're just notes that I'm making. I did teach this class at the Florida School of Preaching a few times, once upon a time, but computer I had all my notes on crashed. All I've got is really hand notes. I'm making some notes as we go along. But anyways, I will continue to give you the notes as we proceed. We should be in Leviticus a couple more weeks. To prepare you who are taking the class for a test, we will certainly let you know everything that we plan on having on the test. As I know for sure, the first 5 offerings will be on the test. Just be able to list them. Maybe some of the symbolism that is assigned for the various and sundry offerings, as well as what does the frankincense seem to represent? It's a white substance. Represents purity. What's salt represent? Preservation. Same thing as, I imagine Jesus was probably vaguely referencing the law of Leviticus when he said, you are the salt of the earth, a preservative. And so, yeah, some of that symbolism might be good for us to remember because it's all pointing towards Christ. And of course, we left off last week with the story of Nadab and Abihu and their tragic death. And of course, obviously, we will be making some sort of test questions about that. The key verse or the key phrase in verse 1, right at the end of it, which he had not commanded them. God did not command them to do what they had done. The book of Exodus gives us specific instructions on what spices or what combination of spices go into the incense, gives you specific directions on how to make the oil, gives you specific directions on how to do these things, and they need to be followed carefully. Don't add to and don't take away from. When we get to the book of Deuteronomy, that's one of our more famous verses from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 4 and verse 2, I believe it is. Don't add to, don't take away from. They were not commanded. Yes, sir.
They offer profane fire. Is that more referring to the incense?
Well, that's where it's hard for scholars to draw a accurate picture of exactly what they've done wrong there. Depending on who you go to, they kind of draw a little bit different picture. And so I kind of hesitate to try to draw a hard and fast picture for you because I'm not sure if the sin is in the fire, if the sin is in the incense. But what I am confident of is the sin is in the phrase which the Lord had not commanded. What you can know is, and again, the late Jackie Steersman, I'll quote this every time I think it's an appropriate thing to say. Where does man get his religious ideas from? Only one of 2 places. Either it comes from God or it comes from man. This is profane fire. Didn't come from God. And so that was the sin, whether they took it off the altar when they shouldn't have. Deut, he paints a picture of them walking around the courtyard, having taken the coals off of the altar of burnt offerings, as though they were high-handed. I'm not sure. But anyways, that's why I kind of just fall back on the phrase that he has not commanded. But what I also noticed, and that's what we did last week, though, is I noticed that the spices for the altar of incense was a specific recipe. You women, I know you men know as well too, but more particularly women. Hey guys, come on in. Recipes. You don't have to mess with a recipe very much to ruin it. Put a little extra of this in that you shouldn't have put in, and you might play with it a little while to get it just where you want it. But once you get a recipe where you want it, you leave it that way. Maybe if you're making something bigger, you got to add more on the fly or whatever, but you get my point. My point is you got to stick to the recipe to get that smell. And so that is the smell of religion. When you smell that, what's the only thing you should be thinking of?
Wow.
It smells like God. The oil, same thing. Gives up the fragrance of God. Shouldn't be any different. Of course, we made the comparison in the New Testament last week. I'm firmly convinced that the music of the New Testament is congregational singing. God, hearing the voice that he made, singing songs, hymns, and spiritual songs one to another, making melody in our hearts. I think I told you last week, if I didn't, I remember, it's the first thing I noticed when I walked in for my very first service, March the 7th, 1993. I remember the date. It was the first thing I noticed. Where's the organ? There's no organ in this place. Now, I wasn't offended or anything. It wasn't like it bothered me. In fact, the singing at South Florida Congregation in Lakeland, Florida, where the school is and where I got baptized, really good singing, as a matter of fact, really good building for singing in too. It didn't offend me, or did I think anything other than I noticed it. And the reason I noticed it is because the pipe organ to me was the sound of religion, sound of church service. I no longer think that. And I think this passage helps us to go a long way. Now, where we kind of left off with this story last week that I think is important is, were they drunk? And oh, by the way, why would I even ask that question? Hey guys, we're back in Leviticus chapter 10. Joe, Trish, thanks for dinner, Joe. Well, we left off last week with Moses with Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, being killed by God. Fire came down from God. They were told they took the bodies outside, and Aaron was told that the anointing oil is upon you. You need to get back to work. You don't even get to mourn your sons. That's how serious he was. And so we went over that last week, but where we left off, I think, is an intriguing thought. Verse 8. Then the Lord spoke to Aaron, saying, do not drink wine or intoxicating drink, nor you, nor your sons with you, when you go into the tabernacle of meeting, lest you die. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations, that you may distinguish between holy and unholy, between unclean and clean, and that you may teach the children of Israel all the statutes which the Lord has spoken to them by the hand of Moses. Why do you think he throws that command in there? Interesting thing to say right after Nadab and Abihu's unfortunate demise. A lot of scholars, and I happen to agree with, I'm not a scholar, but I happen to agree with scholars who do see a connection here. I think Nadab and Abihu probably imbibing, and it probably affected their judgment. And because it affected their judgment, God struck them dead, sending a clear and present message that if you're going to come before me, you need to be able to distinguish between what is holy and what is unholy. And so, yes, some scholars don't necessarily connect that with the story, but I think they're probably right here. I think that's a uncanny place to put that command if it is indeed disconnected from the story of Nadab and Abihu. But what does wine do? It's a mocker. What does it do? Affects your judgment. Strong wine is a mocker. Strong drink. How's that finish? What? Thank you. Yeah, I hadn't quoted it in so long I forgot exactly how it goes. Any good stories in the Bible of alcohol use?
No.
I get kind of annoyed sometimes in Bible class when People want to have the social drinking debate.
Noah probably was one of the, Noah is a,
Yeah, is there any good story in the Bible? Besides the warnings against alcohol, just think about the stories where people are inebriated. What happened to Noah when he planted his vineyard? He humiliated himself. Now, Ham didn't help matters much, but Noah humiliated himself. What happened to, besides Nadab and Abihu, what happened to Belshazzar? What was he doing on the night he was executed? Drinking, getting drunk, using the vessels that he had taken from the temple in Jerusalem to mock the God of Jehovah when he sees the handwriting on the wall. Meeny, meeny, tekel upharsin. Been weighed in the balances and found wanting. But time and time again, we see alcohol and its devastating effects. Yeah, we had that debate in California one time, two guys about ready to go to blows over, I can have a couple of beers after I've cut the grass. And the other guy, of course, is a teetotaler. And I'm just thinking, why are we even having this debate when you consider the incredible destruction that's happened because of alcohol? You don't even have to have that discussion if you don't worry about it, if you don't drink. How much can a human being have without being inebriated? Those are all interesting questions, but my answer tends to be, if you just don't even start, you don't have to worry about where that line is. And by the way, how many other areas in life do we think about, or should we? We should at least recognize that it's an unhealthy way to think. There are some people, I think they live their lives, if this is the line that separates the lost and the saved, then I'm on the safe side, but the line's right here. It's like, I'm gonna live right here. I can sniff. I can still smell the world. Doesn't smell like the altar of incense, but it smells pretty good. But anyways, there are some people that seem to want to live their life as close to the line as possible. I use the analogy of a prison. Guy gets out of prison. What would you think of a guy if he got released from prison after 25 years and then bought a property right across the street from the prison and drank his morning coffee every morning, longingly looking back at the prison that had just imprisoned him for the last 25? Oh, those were the good old days. That would be insane. You're trying to get as far away from this place as possible. But that's not the way we look at it. You can say a prayer for me. If all goes according to plan, I'll have a book by the end of this year. I'm also putting together a seminar. I have a unique perspective on the subject of alcohol use and abuse in the Lord's church, and putting together a book speaks to the community of the recovery as well as the church, and how to look at some of the more difficult questions that we wrestle with when it comes to this topic. Hoping to put together a seminar too, 3-day thing where I will come and discuss this matter at great lengths over the weekend if you would like. But anyways, I got a lot to say about this subject, but not necessarily on this particular topic, other than I think Nadab and Abihu were probably imbibing. And I think that's part of the problem. And so even if you don't buy that in this particular story, I think we can still say that wine is a mocker. And those who are led astray by it are not wise. The next story in Leviticus chapter 10, problem is they don't feel much like eating the sacrifice after all of this disaster has happened upon them, and Moses is greatly upset by it. But I think their answer is pretty good. Remember, when it comes to these sacrifices, the fat is on the altar. Whose portion is that considered? It's considered God's. But then the offerer and the priest would share, depending on which sacrifice we're talking about. It gets very confusing depending on the sacrifice you're talking about. But they would share in the sacrificial meal. The priest lived off the sacrificial or the sacrifices that people would bring up, but the offerer would share in it as well. While Nadab and Aaron and Eleazar and Ithamar, his sons, did not want to share in this sacrifice because, stop and think about that for a second. If a sin offering, what's the purpose of a sin offering? Just get rid of sin, right? Transfer the sin to the animal, sacrifice the animal, and therefore my sins are imputed to the animal. Part of the problem, I think, for Aaron and his remaining sons is that's the sin offering, but we haven't even dealt with sin in the camp. You got Nadab and Abihu who just did what they did. How can we participate in the sin offering? And so I think that you have an issue here with two stories in chapter 10. They're kind of opposite sides of the coin. The one is what was in Nadab's and Abihu's heart was why God judged them more than anything. But what was in Aaron, Eleazar, and Ithamar's heart was a little purer, even though they actually technically should have eaten the offering. But they did not. So that's the end of chapter 10. Chapter 11, we start getting into clean and unclean animals. And what kind of questions come to your mind when we think about clean and unclean animals? We usually end up finding ourselves having some sort of discussion on why God would make certain animals unclean versus why other animals were clean. And a lot of times you've probably noticed people tend to look for health considerations in there. Look at these animals that we're not supposed to eat and how unhealthy they are for us. And that's a nice path to go down. I think there's a lot of truth in that path. Yes, sir.
It's interesting to look at the very first chapter of the Bible, Genesis 1:26, God said, "I'll give you every green herb, it shall be meat for you." So the plants were considered meat. So this first man was definitely vegan, he was a vegetarian, meat. But it seems that after the flood is when man started consuming meat. And at that same time, that you see a decrease in life and longevity. And that's when all of that took place there.
Mm-hmm.
And so now that you've given them a prescription of what they should eat, and I've always had, and I've had debates with people who would tell me that we don't eat pork, we don't eat shrimp, we don't eat the catfish, those type of things. And my always argument was that was for the children of Israel. That was not for the Gentiles. And with Gentiles, so that does not apply. And I understand it's good dietary practices. All of the laws are good hygiene, good dietary practices. But that was for specific people and not for the entire race of people. There were other people who raised and were not Jewish people, but they are careful also.
And keep that in mind because we're about to make that point. What was I going to say? Oh, did Noah eat meat?
Sacrifice. The sacrifice when he came off the.
That was a burnt offering, though. Burnt offering was a whole offering. I tend to agree with you, but it's not the only reason I brought it up is, actually, let's look at it for a second. Look at Genesis chapter 9. As Carl rightly points out, Genesis chapter 1, what is on the menu for mankind? Vegetarian.
129.
Now, here's a question for you. Between chapter 1, what verse was that again? Verse 30. 29 and 30. Genesis 1, 29 and 30. God said, I've given you every green or every herb that yields seed, which is on the face of all the earth, every tree whose fruit yields seed. It shall be food for you. Also, every beast of the earth, to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps in the earth, in which there is life, I have given every green herb for food, and it was so. Is there any evidence that between that passage and the flood that man ate meat? Scholars are on both sides of the issue as far as whether they did or not. But what we can say with confidence is, if Noah and his family were accustomed to eating meat, the scriptures are silent on it. There's nothing between Genesis 1:30 in regards to diet that suggests that anybody before the flood ate meat. Again, there are some people that say they did, but biblically speaking, the scriptures are silent. Go ahead.
I was just bringing up that Cain and Abel, that Cain sacrificed his animals. Of course, animals were for wool, sheep they were raised for fabric or for clothing. But even with that, the animals, the reason you raise the animals too bold for the wool, for the meat, or for the milk to provide. 3 things that have to provide wolves.
But the other thing that's missing from that argument is the sacrifices in the book of Genesis are burnt offerings, and they didn't participate of it. They didn't eat from the burnt offering. So even though, yes, they were sacrificing animals, but were they eating them? And I'm not saying they weren't. But what I am saying is you can't prove it by the scriptures. Now, with that assumption in mind, and that's all it is an assumption, there are some curious things in Genesis chapter 9. Look at 9. Anybody know how old Noah was when he got off of the ark? Because I think it matters. Is he 35 or 36? He was 600. I was just seeing if anybody's awake in here. Hello, is this microphone on? Yeah, he was 600 years old, and that matters for this reason. Look at Genesis 9, verse 1. God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Verse 2 is a significant verse. And the fear of you and the dread of you shall be on every beast of the earth, on every bird of the air, on all that move on the earth, and on all the fish of the sea. They are given into your hand. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. I've given you all things, even as the green herbs. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, in its blood. Keep that passage in mind, because we will remember that before the night is over as well. Verse 5, excuse me. Surely for your lifeblood, I will demand a reckoning from the hand of every beast. I will require it from the hand of man. From the hand of every man's brother, I will require the life of man. Verses 2, 3, and 5 get my attention for this reason. As I just said, Noah was 600 years old when he got on the ark, right? Parents, grandparents, do you ever have your adult kids over the house for a Sunday dinner? Or maybe a Saturday dinner, depending on where, who you are and where you're from? Isn't that the exact kind of stuff families do together? Hey, we're killing the fatted calf Sunday, come on over. Everybody's welcome. Don't we do that? Wouldn't you expect Noah would have done that after 600 years if they had been eating the fatted calf? Because here's my question. If Noah was accustomed to calling his sons and their wives over to the house to kill the fatted calf and have a meal together, why does God have to tell him that right there? Been doing it for 600 years. Which makes more sense? Because I've got scholars, I think Smith in his book, I haven't read it for this class or for Genesis in a while. I think Smith makes the suggestion that they had always been eating meat, but God is just restating it. Well, I'm not going to say he's wrong, but here's what gets my attention. Which makes more sense? That God is giving them new information, or he's restating something that surely he already knew? Same thing with the fear of you and the dread of every animal shall be on, or the fear of you and the dread of you shall be on every animal. Again, if you're Noah and you're 600 years old, you're used to what animals are dangerous and what animals aren't. And oh, by the way, after 600 years, you suppose the lion killed somebody? And we went and put the lion down because he killed somebody? Yeah, if lions had already killed somebody. But my question is, why does no one need to be told that if that's the way things have always been? Seems to me God is giving him new information. I think what God is telling him is when you get off the ark, Noah, some things are different. Meat is now on the menu. Animals are going to be afraid of you. And also, if an animal kills you, put it down. And again, what sense does that make if that's, if Noah had always known that anytime an animal kills a human, we're going to kill that animal. That's just how we handle those things. If that had just been the way of things, why is it in Genesis 9? It seems to me that the world after the flood was a bold new place. And while I'm not going to say it with certainty, I'm not sure that man ever ate meat until after they got off of the ark. You certainly don't read about it in the scriptures. but I think that it was a bold new world they were stepping into, and that some things had changed. And that's really one of the gray periods for me is, by the way, well, let me finish one thought before I start another. Yeah, one of the gray periods for me is, how much did the world deteriorate from sin getting into the world in Genesis 3 to Genesis 6? It's time to build an ark now. What was that downward trend like? And I say that in this sense. Now I'll introduce my next thought. What do you suppose Adam named? Who named all the animals, by the way? What do you think he called the T-Rex? You suppose it was Adam that named Behemoth? And the answer is no. You know how I'm so confident? How did death get into the world? Sin. Wages of sin is death. Through one man, death entered the world. Romans chapter 5, verse 12. The one man being Adam, he isn't said in that verse, but contextually it's Adam. Through one man, sin entered the world and death through sin. Everybody got that? Who's the first man? Adam and Eve's the first sin, right? The animal kingdom's been created before that, right? Well, then no animal ever killed another animal for food, because that would have been death. And nothing had died. So whatever animals that Adam had dominion over, when they came up to him and he named them, I don't think there could have been a carnivore among them. Now, some people would say something like, Mike, didn't you live in Florida for 30 years? Never saw a gator, huh? You ever seen those big choppers they got in front there? I don't think they could be made for anything other than tearing flesh. Mike, what's wrong with you? And you know my answer to that is? Two things. Number one, what happened to Satan? Or excuse me, what happened to the serpent? What was the sentence pronounced on the serpent? Apparently he wasn't crawling on his belly before that happened. The physical structure of the snake must have changed somehow. Was that the only animal that physical structure changed over time? I would say no, because obviously those animals existed and they do use their teeth to tear flesh. The only point I'm trying to make is none of that happened before sin and death entered the world. So the animals that God created on the day of creation, sixth day, when he created the beasts, there was no flesh terrors among those. He didn't need them. They were eating vegetables, just like the fruits and vegetables, just like Adam and Eve were. That's a process that came in. And now I hadn't forgotten where I was at. Now we're all the way up to Genesis chapter 9, and suddenly we're laying down laws that you would think Noah would not need unless something new has happened, which is what I tend to believe. I believe Noah stepped off of the ark, and now suddenly the nature of the animal world's different. The animal world didn't necessarily run from man before the flood. Now they do. They weren't, I don't think they were killing people before the flood, or else Noah would already have known how to deal with it. And yet now they do. So anyways, yeah.
We have a hand.
Yep.
We have a hand online.
Oh, I didn't know you could do that. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Margaret.
How's that work?
Okay.
Margaret, yeah, go for it.
Also, when they've been on the flood and you get off, you ask any farmer when you've had something that's been flooded for a long time, vegetation doesn't survive that. So even if they'd been eating vegetation all that time, for man, they couldn't have had, the vegetation would have not been there. They would have had to have meat to eat.
So the idea could be, and that's a great point. Thank you, Margaret. Did you have anything else?
No, that's all.
Oh, well, that's great. Thank you. I like what she's thrown on the table there. The idea is maybe they were eating meat, but because it was something they didn't do very often, God's having to encourage them to do that. But anyways, that's a great thought. But certainly Noah is being encouraged to eat meat, which to me, again, Damien, did you have a hand or was you just pointing that out to me? Somebody, yeah, go ahead, Cephas.
The aspect of when Eve entered the scene,
I'm sorry?
when evil, like someone said, good and evil,
Uh-huh.
entered the scene, would that have an impact on the serpent? Because it said it's gonna fall in your belly, fall on your belly from that point. But that would change evil into animals to change their mindset. Because at first they were all, they wasn't killing each other or killing.
Right.
So, but even when he changed the serpent, would that would change some animals?
Nature.
Yes.
Yeah, well, and that's the great question. I'm trying to say that I'm, not really, it's still a great mystery to me, let's put it that way, is yes, everything has changed at Genesis chapter 3. But how slow is that change till you get to Genesis 9? How slow is that downward corruption, if you will, until we wake up in Genesis 6 and the heart of man is evil continuously? That's what I don't know. But yes, everything has changed. Here's another thing I would offer up, and then we'll move on. You ever seen, people tend to do this with Just Say No to Drugs campaign. You ever seen this, maybe a meme on Facebook? I've seen it on Facebook before, but I've seen it in other places too. Somebody put a picture up of a high school graduate. Remember what you looked like on graduation day? You still had hair. There was a twinkle in your eyes and a smile. You had hope, basically. You're standing there looking like $1 million. And then they put the picture up right next to him. It's the same person that got arrested 5 years later, crack addict now. And you're looking at the pictures and you're going, man, we need facial recognition just to be able to, are you sure that's the same person? You can't be. And you're looking at that and you're like, wow, I can barely recognize that's the same person. That's what sin did to that person in 5-10 years. Destroyed them physically. Why should it be such a strain of the imagination that the same thing happened in the animal kingdom over time? That an animal kingdom that was docile upon creation, because sin and death wasn't part of the equation. But over time, they became more affected by the sinful world around them. And that's what I mean about it. I'm not sure how far that downward progress went until Genesis 9, when we see that God is giving them specific instructions on what to do in case the animal kingdom does attack you. But anyways, that seems to me, and you go back to Leviticus now, that seems to me to be the best explained by the idea that that's kind of new information for Noah and his sons. But I like what Margaret's thoughts were. I hadn't heard that before. Thank you, Margaret. All right, Genesis chapter 11, of course, distinguishing between clean and unclean animals. The clean animals that are listed is in verses 1 through 8. Among all the beasts, verse 3, whoever divides the hoof, having cloven hoofs and chewing the cud, that you may eat. Nevertheless, those you shall not eat among those that chew the cud, are those that have cloven hoofs. The camel, because it chews the cud but does not have cloven hooves, is unclean to you. This kind of reading that can put you to sleep. Yeah. If you're anybody seen that Geico commercial where Flo's sister calls her over and says, "You want to talk about insurance?" She said, "No, I want you to talk about insurance." And she starts talking about the insurance and her baby goes to sleep. Thank you. These are the kind of chapters where if you're not sleeping very well, you can get lost in some of these names, and who cares?
Thank you for explaining that commercial.
That was the whole point of that. Yeah. She called Flo over because when Flo talks insurance, people go to sleep. And these are the kind of chapters where people go to sleep. And of course, that's why I began the chapter the way I did, where we tend to look for, well, why do we need to know what kind of animals were clean, what kind of animals were unclean? How does that affect us? What would it have mattered outside of, in their day? And so, one of the things we tend to do is we go looking for the health benefits, and why some animals would have been listed unclean. Oh, okay, well, that makes sense. That kind of thing. But I think there's a more important reason. Verse 9, he goes into, well, I'll get to that in a minute. Let me, just notice what's in the chapter first. In verse 9, these you may eat of all that are in the water. Whatever's in the water that has fins and scales, whatever's in the seas or the rivers that you may eat, whether in the seas or the rivers that you may eat. But in all the seas or the rivers that do not have fins and scales, all that move in the water, any living thing which is in the water, they are an abomination to you. So verses 9 through 12, these are the water animals you can and cannot eat. Verses 13 through 19, the birds of the air, or at least birds that are very close to the ground. Verse 13, these you shall regard as an abomination among the birds. They shall not be eaten. They are an abomination. The eagle, the vulture, the buzzard, kite, falcon after its kind, the raven after its kind, ostrich, short-eared owl, seagull, the hawk after its kind, little owl, fisher owl, screech owl, white owl, jackdaw, whatever that is, and the carrion vulture, stork, the heron after its kind, the hoopoe after, and the bat. Didn't you show me a picture of the hoopoe the other day there, Damien? I didn't know what a hoopoe was, but Damien hooked me up. You get into verse 29, you get into the creeping things that you can eat and cannot eat. And again, there's a very curious tendency among us to want to, take a look at those animals, see if we can figure out why they're unclean and why they're clean from a health standpoint. And all of that is fine, but we're not Jews, we're Christians. And if we're going to take a class on a Tuesday night to study these things, what do you suppose we're supposed to be learning from this? I mean, does it really matter in today's world what animals were clean, what animals were unclean? No. But the Old Testament is always pointing towards Christ and towards his church and towards life in the church. And what do you suppose we're supposed to learn when we think about it that way?
I have specific instructions for his children. That goes into, as we said before, it's not what he had commanded. He gave instructions.
First and foremost, obedience. What is the hallmark of a Christian? Do you understand why you're doing it? Not really. Why are you doing it then? Because God told me to. I don't have to understand it. Don't eat that animal. Don't touch that one. You can have that one. You can have that one. Stay away from these ones. Why? I don't know. God told me. Does it really need to get any more complicated than that? Shouldn't, but it does. But keep something else in mind too.
The word abomination is pretty serious.
Yeah. Yeah. Word abomination does not get thrown around lightly in Scripture. Anytime something is an abomination, we might want to pay attention to it. But here's the ones that really get my attention is verses 9 through 12, the water animals. Here's why I say that. What book, Old Testament scholars, in what book of the Old Testament did the Jews actually settle the land? They weren't in the land before they started, now they're in it. The land is settled. What book discusses all that? Starts with a J, rhymes with Ashua. Book of Joshua. The question might have not led you in the direction I was trying to get you to go. Joshua. Book of Joshua. The Jews come into the promised land, take it by force, beginning in chapter 13, I believe it is. They start settling up the land. By the end of the book of Joshua, the Jews are living in the land that they have settled. Any of those tribes of the 12 tribes, any of them get land butted up to the Mediterranean Sea or maybe even the Sea of Galilee? And the answer is yeah. Who were the apostles again? Professionally speaking? Fishermen. You think Peter ever went down into his net and found unclean fish? Unclean fish on a night where he didn't catch anything and he's not likely to be able to take anything to the market. And Gentile world uses this fish. This is valuable in their eyes. This is a delicacy in their eyes. I could easily sell it to somebody else, make it. No, you don't look at it that way, Peter. Get rid of it. Stop and think about the farmer. How many animals are on his property, on a given night? Moles out there looking for, mice in the earth or whatever that's unclean. In an agricultural world or in a seafaring people that knows the animals of the sea very well, you see how many choices they would be making all day long? You're walking down the street and the guy turns the corner and he's leading a camel. Maybe I better get over here on the other side of the street. Why? Well, I'm not sure if that's a clean or an unclean animal. What's the safest thing to do? And move over here. If it's a clean animal and I didn't touch it, I can't get in trouble. But if it's an unclean animal and I do touch it, what happens? I'm defiled until I wash and until evening. And it could be worse depending on, maybe you got to go to the temple tomorrow, whatever. Point being, notice how all through life you're making decisions. Everywhere you go, there's animals you have to wrestle with. Is that clean or is that unclean? You're making choices. Sometimes in the Old Testament, I think one of the keys to look for is notice what the Jews do physically, but the Christian does spiritually. What do you do from the moment you wake up in the morning until we go to bed at night? We make choices. We make choices and decisions about what we are going to do and what we aren't going to do. Are those choices clean or unclean? Yeah. Take a break Monday at work. Take a break at 10 o'clock, go into the break room and you drop in your coins in the coffee machine. And you're going to sit down at this table with some other workmates, but you hear one of the employees talking about his weekend exploits and how he spent the weekend at the bar. And let me tell you all my conquer. You're going to go sit down? That's an unclean conversation right there. You do sit down to somebody else right next to you and go, do you know what I heard about Katrina? It's an unclean conversation I was just invited to. I don't choose to participate in the unclean world. Just as in the physical world, I believe the Jews were constantly making choices about when it came to animals. This is clean, this is unclean, stay away from that. We make the same kind of choices in the spiritual realm. Have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness. Come out and be separate from among them. We're supposed to be making choices about living a holy life, a clean life, not participating in unclean activities, whether they be thought, word, or deed. What should you do if you have an uncharitable thought while you're sitting there? Yeah. Damon, I understand you preach Sunday? Yeah, I heard all the compliments. Why didn't you credit me? I'm your teacher. Don't you know this all goes back to me? I didn't hear one, well, thank you, Mike Elledge. I wasn't a very good preacher till I met you. Point being, preachers can get jealous too. And he's getting too many compliments. Somebody ever compliments me. Is that a pure thought? Anybody need to hear that thought? No, you don't, other than I'm using it as a silly way to illustrate a point. When you have those kinds of thoughts, what are you supposed to do with them? It's an unclean thought. Be mad at Damon because somebody else complimented his sermon. What's wrong with you? What kind of preaching is that? Those are the kind of thoughts you're supposed to be chasing out all day long, every day. When you have an uncharitable thought, just because nobody else hears it, God sees it. All your thoughts are as open to God as anything you say or do in front of the world. God knows what's in your heart. If you have an unclean thought, and by the way, what did Jesus mean when, I think we talked about this last week, but it bears repeating. You have heard it said by them of old, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you, whoever looks upon a woman to lust after her, has committed adultery in his heart. What's the point he's making with that? A Jew could spend his entire life lusting after women everywhere he went, so long as he didn't do anything about it. His conscience was clear. I didn't commit adultery. And what's Jesus come along and say? God's always seeing what's in your heart. You've got adultery in your heart. Not only do you have adultery in your heart, it doesn't shame you, and you're not repenting of it. And God sees that. Unclean. And so I think the best thing that I like to do with these distinctions between clean and unclean is just simply notice that as a Christian, we make those kinds of choices all day long. Now, are there several animals on that list that, we find out, there's some health benefits to avoiding those animals. That's true. But far as I'm concerned, I'm glad I wasn't Moses. I like waking up to the smell of bacon. Poor Moses, never had. I had bacon just before I got here. Again, I'm being silly, but you get my point. My point is that just like the Jews made decisions, by the way, there's some other things I think, here's one of, sometimes you answer questions, you like your answer, and other times you don't particularly like your answer. But a guy asked me this question one day, or actually I didn't remember the question he asked, but he asked me a question that required a lengthy explanation. And so I walked him through whatever he was struggling with. You know what he said to me after I walked him through it? He said, Mike, that makes sense to me. He said, man, that was long and drawn out. Why can't I just get a simple answer and be on my way? And my answer was that? Because then you'd be on your way. That's one of the problems people have with religion. Slow down. I think one of the ways people get off track sometimes is just take on too much and the life is moving too fast for them. Slow down. I think part of the Christian life is a quiet, meditative life. We pray for our leaders so we can lead a quiet, peaceable life where we think about things. And, if you're a farmer and you're looking at animals, you're a fisherman, you're looking at fish in the sea, you're making distinctions. Why would God say that's unclean? Well, stop and think about it for a minute. What did Peter say about sows? Anybody remember when Peter was trying to let us know what happens to the Christian who gets entangled again in the pollutions of the world? Look at 2 Peter chapter 2. 2 Peter chapter 2. And by the way, here is a great question before you ever read this. If you're ever dealing with somebody that believes once you're saved, you're always saved. This is a pretty good passage to turn them to. But before you read it, ask them this question. True or false? All accountable people are in one of two realms. You're either in the world or you're in Christ. Don't read the passage before you ask that question. Make the person who believes once you're saved, you're always saved. Make them answer that question. Because I had a Bible study with a denominational preacher who believed it, and he answered it for me. He said, does that mean somebody's got a question? Oh, I thought maybe I was learning code language around it. Make them answer the question, because this guy rightly answered. It's true that all accountable people, there's only two places you can be spiritually speaking. You are either in the world or you're in Christ. That's it. There's no third realm. You're in the world or in Christ. Well, okay, look at 2 Peter chapter 2, drop down to verse 20. For if after they have escaped the pollutions of the world, through the knowledge of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and they are again entangled in them and overcome, the latter end is worse for them than the beginning. We'll stop right there for a minute. How can the latter end be worse than the beginning if these people had escaped the pollutions of the world? If there's only two realms you can be, you're either in Christ or you're in the world. The people Peter's talking about here have escaped the world. If that doesn't describe the Christian, I don't know what does. These people have escaped the pollutions of the world. Problem is, they got entangled again in them. And then Peter says in verse 21, for it would have been better for them not to have known the way of righteousness than having known it to turn from the holy commandment delivered to them. But it has happened to them, according to a true proverb, a dog returns to his own vomit, and a sow having washed to her wallowing in the mire. You can go back to Leviticus 11. Anybody know why sows actually wallow in the mire? What's that? Cools them off. Yeah, might look filthy and disgusting, but it's actually a benefit to the sow, him wallowing around in the mire. But if you're sitting on the porch watching sows wallow around in the mire, do your thoughts think clean or unclean? Well, man, that looks nasty. When you see a vulture, and by the way, aren't you glad? I can't believe that carrions and animals that clean up dead carcasses. I don't know how people don't see God in that. There's nature's vacuum cleaner. Here comes nature's vacuum cleaner to take care of the animal that got hit on the road. And it's incredible to me. But does anyone want to eat an animal that's out there picking on a corpse? Do you see how the uncleanness just kind of oozes out of some animals? You know, this guy's got a great chapter. I was going to read it, but I'm not going to worry about it. But he's got a great paragraph in his chapter about some of the things that Jews would have, you know, stopped and thought about. You know, the moth, or I mean, not the moth, but the snail is unclean. Well, why would a snail be unclean? Have you ever watched a snail crawl across the leaf? There's a big pile of snot as he goes. They're clean or unclean. Think about the eagle. Man, you're watching an eagle. Are they impressive? Yeah, America likes to use the eagle for a symbol. Yeah, we're pretty impressed by eagles. And so am I. And you're watching an eagle and you can't believe what you're seeing, the majestic nature of an eagle and how incredible. Man, he's just flown 4 miles. He hadn't flapped his wings once. And you're watching him and you're in awe. And all of a sudden he comes down close to the water, boom, grabs a fish, or maybe I should say on the land, grabs a mouse, and off he goes. And you're thinking, wow, I was pretty impressed by him a minute ago. Now I'm scared of him. I forgot he's got claws on the end of that thing. And suddenly you're seized by, oh yeah, we live in a fallen world, don't we? And even the majestic eagle feeds himself that way. What a brutal world we live in. 1 minute I'm in awe of him, the next minute I'm blown away by the vanity of the world we live in and by the bitterness. I mean, as you're watching animals, you can almost see why some would be on the unclean list. And you can almost see how they would be illustrations and images that would help you to see what's unclean about them. And so for my way of thinking, I like to look at the laws of unclean and clean kind of from that purpose. Look at verses 41 through 47. To end the chapter, he sums it up with the purpose of the dietary laws. Every creeping thing that creeps on the earth shall be an abomination. There's that word again. It shall not be eaten. And by the way, why would creeping things that creep on the earth be an abomination? And probably the first thing that's abominable. What do snakes do? Yeah. And the creeping things just kind of take the mind, if you're thinking biblically, it kind of takes your mind right back to the garden where sin was let into the earth, the creeping things. And so, again, some of these you can almost see why they would be on the unclean list. Every creeping thing that creeps on the earth shall be an abomination. It shall not be eaten. Whatever crawls on its belly, whatever goes on all fours, whatever has many feet, all creeping things that creep on the earth, you shall not eat, for they are an abomination. You shall not make yourselves abominable with any creeping thing that creeps, nor shall you make yourselves unclean with them, lest you be defiled by them. And I've got this verse highlighted. For I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore sanctify yourselves. You shall be holy, for I am holy. Neither shall you defile yourselves with any creeping thing that creeps on the earth. For I am the Lord who brings you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy. This is the law of the beasts and of the birds, every living creature that moves in the water, every creature that creeps on the earth, to distinguish between unclean and the clean, and between the animal that may be eaten and the animal that may not be eaten. And of course, as I think it was Carl's already pointed out, I got nailed to the cross. But how important were those dietary restrictions to the average Jew? It was so important, Peter had to have a vision. What happened in Acts chapter, what chapter is that, 10? Yeah, what happened in Acts chapter 10?
I think animals, why would a Jew go into a Gentile and go to Canisius' household? But he's trying to make a distinction. So, yeah, I see that.
You must be feeling something pretty strong when you start arguing with God. Not so, Lord. I've never eaten anything unclean. Peter almost can't conceive of the fact that that could be clean now. And of course, what I really like, anybody remember what God's response is?
Call nothing unclean that I've not called clean.
Just before that. Very good, but just before that. Arise, I'll get you started. Arise, Peter, kill and eat. You know why I like that phrase? I got a niece who was baptized. Back in the day when you had to have a Bible study through the mail. That's how old I am. There was no computers. I was writing the letters and putting a stamp on them, having a Bible study. And I won. I got 3 people who wouldn't have gotten baptized without that Bible study to get baptized. But one of them is no longer faithful to the Lord, but she's a vegetarian. And her chief argument is she just doesn't think it's right to kill animals. Very sensitive, tender-hearted person, doesn't like the idea of killing animals for food. But, she calls herself a Christian, which means the scriptures are supposed to mean something to you. And that's the passage I quoted to her. Arise, Peter, kill and eat. You don't want to eat, you don't have to. And she doesn't bind it on anybody, so it's not like, it's a major issue for us. But the only thing I try to point out to her is, and be careful now, if you don't want to eat because you're that sensitive towards causing the death of an animal, God bless you in your sensitivity. But God did say to Peter, arise, Peter, kill and eat. And the thing we have to be careful is that we don't move from sensitivity to that to suddenly somehow it's wrong. There's nothing wrong with it. We should treat animals with dignity, and their death should, I'm glad I never had to go out into, hey, Mike, we're going to have chicken for dinner tonight. And I got to go out in the yard and kill a chicken. I've never had to do that. I just drive to Colonel Sanders. He takes care of it for me. So I'm glad I didn't have to do that. But guess what? If I had been raised at a different time and that's how you ate fried chicken, I'd be out there wringing his neck. Because arise, Peter, kill
My
him.
little kid was to get chickens.
What's that?
When I was a little kid, we get chickens. I used to watch my dad cut their heads off and watch them flop around the yard.
Do you know that image is in the Book of Mormon? I forget his name now, but somebody got his head chopped off and he was flopping around before he finally gave up the ghost. All right, anyways, the law of unclean and clean. But obviously that's been nailed to the cross. The distinguishing in this world between what is clean and unclean. Christian will be doing that for the rest of his life, and hopefully we do it one day at a time because life is difficult. You make decisions all day long. Sometimes we don't really appreciate just how much of your life at the end of the day is you're right where you are supposed to be based on the decisions you make. Now, life has a way of taking you places you never expected to go, and decisions that were made for you, that kind of thing. But still, in a grand sense, we are the sum total of our decisions that we make. But anyways, clean and unclean. Chapter 12 is the law concerning childbirth. It's a small chapter, but can't help but think of Mary, Joseph, and Jesus when I read this chapter. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, chapter 12, verse 1, saying, speak to the children of Israel, saying, if a woman has conceived and born a male child, then she shall be unclean 7 days. As in the days of her customary impurity, she shall be unclean. And on the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. Anybody remember where circumcision started in the Bible? What chapter? 17. Genesis 17. That's where God changes Abram's name from Abram to Abraham. Father, Abram meant multitude, or high father, and Abraham means father of a multitude. Now that's significant because anybody know what chapter Isaac's born in? It's chapter 21, I believe. I'm thinking off the top of my head. I think it's chapter 21. Don't quote me on that. But Isaac hasn't been born in chapter 17. How many children does Abraham have in chapter 17? He's got one. Ishmael. Chapter 16 is where Sarah, thinking she's not part of the divine plan, gives Abraham her handmaiden Hagar. Hagar, of course, and Abraham produced, or excuse me, yeah, Hagar and Abraham produce Ishmael. And then in chapter 17, a couple things I'd like to say to that. Number one, chapter 17 is where God changes his name. I think he's 99 years old. He's only had one child after 24 years. And then God changes his name to Father of a Multitude. By the way, all you got to do is read the life of Abraham and you will see why God chose him, because of his tremendous character. And one of the great things about his character was his faithfulness. You know, at 75, he hadn't had any children yet. When God reveals to him that, you know, he's going to be a father of a multitude, it doesn't happen for 25 years. But anyways, chapter 17 is where Abraham's name is changed and circumcision is enforced. By the way, when I moved out to California, they sent me the most grueling questionnaire I ever had to fill out to get a job as a preacher. And it was awesome. I loved it, man. They wanted to know everything. But there's the only congregation that ever asked me this question. I hadn't thought about how to answer it until they asked me. What do you think about things like artificial insemination and surrogate motherhood? And of course, when I'm reading it, I'm like, you need to get a smart preacher. I don't even know how to answer that question. And one of the things that occurred to me is, what happens when you rush God's plan? I can think of two stories in the book of Genesis that ought to give all Christians pause. Where did Ishmael come from? God made a promise to Abraham. He didn't make it to Sarah. Sarah didn't, you know, she started to conclude, well, okay, maybe Abraham's going to have a child, but it won't be through me. By chapter 16, she's still patient. What does she do? Here you go, Abraham. Raise up a child or have a child with Hagar, and I'll raise it up as my own. We'll have a child that way. Who did Ishmael end up fathering? Is the world troubled by the descendants of Ishmael to this day?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir, they are. Thank you. Maybe you shouldn't rush God's plan. Where did the Moabites and the Ammonites come from? Remember when Lot impregnated his two daughters? Oh, by the way, there's another story about the joys of alcoholism. Congratulations, your son is also your grandson. Figure that one out. But who were the two of the chief enemies of the Jews throughout their history? Moabites and the Ammonites. By the time we get to the book of Deuteronomy, where are the Jews? They're in the plains of Moab. Moab was Lot's son. Should have known who God is. And of course, the point being, there's your two stories for you where people rushed God's plan. Lot's daughters could not conceive of life without having children. And they were so insistent on having children, they got their own father to impregnate them. And two of Israel's greatest enemies were produced because Lot's daughters couldn't wait on God. And so I kind of formulated an answer around that. But to me, those are two pretty good stories to tell you, you know, as frustrating as it is, be careful when you start rushing God's plan. It could lead to bigger trouble than you ever thought about. But anyways, chapter 12, verse 3. And the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. That goes back to Genesis 12. You may recall Paul stated his credentials by the fact that he was circumcised on the 8th day. What is he trying to show in Philippians chapter 2 there? He's trying to show that, right. Is it 2 or 3? I think it's 3, right at the beginning of chapter 3. But yeah, he's bragging about it. Circumcised on the 8th day. That's the way you're supposed to be circumcised, according to the law of Moses. She shall continue, verse 4, in the blood of her purification 33 days. She shall not touch any hallowed thing, nor come into the sanctuary until the days of her purification are fulfilled. But if she bears a female child, then she shall be unclean 2 weeks in her customary impurity, and she shall continue in the blood of her purification 66 days. When the days of her purification are fulfilled, whether a son or a daughter, she shall bring to the priest a lamb of the first year as a burnt offering, and a young pigeon or a turtle dove as a sin offering to the door of the tabernacle of meeting. Then he shall offer it before the Lord and make atonement for her, and she shall be clean from the flow of her blood. This is the law for her who has borne a male or a female. And if she is not able to bring a lamb, then she may bring 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. One is a burnt offering, the other is a sin offering. So the priest shall make atonement for her, and she will be clean. So when Mary and Joseph presented Jesus in Luke chapter 2 at the temple, how old was Jesus? Have to be at least 40 days old, because she was unclean for 40 days. And so her and Joseph would not have taken Jesus down to the temple until he was at least 40 days old, and she had passed the ceremonial uncleanness, which lasts 40 days for a man. I bring that up for a couple of reasons, but number one, how many wise men were at the nativity scene? We should all know they were just advertising that last week or last month. Every house in the neighborhood's got a nativity scene up there. By the way, did you know those wise men, the 3 of them, have names? History has given them names. I can't think of them off the top of my head. J.W. McGarvey mentions them by name. I could look it up. But anyways, they have names. Why do you suppose, legend has it that there was 3? 3 gifts. But we don't know how many there were. Right. But I bring up the nativity scene because we've always got, not only is it 3 wise men, but we've always got them right there at the manger scene. Did the 3 wise men, see, even got me to it. Did the wise men show up to the manger? What's the last thing the wise men did before they left town? Saw Jesus. You go back and read Luke and Matthew carefully, you will notice that they were supposed to go back to Herod and tell him where they saw Jesus at. They didn't do it. They left another way. So the last thing they did was see Jesus. Jesus wasn't presented to the temple, at least for 40 days. And if that's the last thing they did, must have been after her purification. So I don't see how they could have been to the manger scene. But anyways, we all knew that the manger scene, of course, for a lot of reasons is to be avoided and that kind of thinking. Yes, sir.
This is interesting something I had not thought about. We studied in the previous chapter 10, that a male, a husband, offered this sacrifice for his family. And then we talked about last week with a father have done it for his whole family, with the ones that were brought that lamb for his whole family. It was see a woman being asked to bring her own sacrifice. So was there a separate sacrifice for women and for men, or is this only during the childbirth period?
I don't think this was for Mary exclusively, but the question that's similar that I was just about to bring up, that I think your question is leaning on, so to speak. Why are we offering sacrifices for childbirth anyways? What's particularly sinful about that? I think Mary and Joseph were offering them together, but I do like the question. But I think the household, the Jewish women did not have to go up to the feast. Notice Mary does go up. I think that speaks to her character. I don't care if I have to or not, I want to. But the sacrifice would have been for the household there. But the general question to me that I think is worth asking is, why are we offering a sin offering anyway? The marriage is marriage is honorable before God, and the bed undefiled. There's nothing wrong with a faithful husband and wife having a child. And in Mary's case, she didn't have a child the regular way. This is Jesus we're talking about. The Holy Spirit overshadowed Mary. Yeah, here she is offering a sacrifice.
You said, what like I was conceived in sin?
That's David, Psalm 51, verse 5. Most scholars will say that while she's offering a sin offering, there is no moral lapse associated with it. And while I don't disagree with that, I would add this point to it, though. And I don't even know that I'm right. It's just the way my brain thinks about the subject until I hear something that causes me to change. What was the sentence imposed on Eve for sin coming into the world? And since there's nothing particularly sinful about getting pregnant with your husband, and in Mary's case, she didn't get pregnant with Joseph. She's just pregnant with the Holy Spirit had overshadowed her. So there's no sin involved, but here she is offering a sin. And I'm wondering if it doesn't go back to the fact that it's supposed to remind women that it was never supposed to be this way. The ordeal that you experience in childbirth was not part of the original intention, which is another great mystery I don't know the answer to, is what was childbirth originally designed? What was that experience supposed to be like? I don't know, but I know it wasn't supposed to be like what we experience in today's world. And so I'm wondering if that's the reason. And then the last thing I would say, and then we'll take a break. Anybody remember what Mary and Joseph offered up when they took Jesus up to the temple? To that's what poor people offer up. Did that get anyone's attention?
Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Where was it?
That's a good point. Or did they?
It was the time they received the wealth, the gift from the wise men.
But what I'm trying to go over the timeline quick in my head. I don't think they'd seen the wise men yet.
Okay.
I think that would have been just
By
after.
the time they went to no, they were still in Egypt. Well, they didn't offer. They go to Egypt. They went to Egypt after. Okay.
I think I'm right, but don't quote me on that. But anyways, point being, yeah, Mary and Joseph are offering turtle doves. What does that tell you about their poverty? And it's kind of amazing to me. And by the way, comedians every now and then really get annoying me. And one of the lines the comedians like to go down is acting like Moses didn't know where he was going in the wilderness. Or I heard Jim Gaffigan said, "You think Jesus was a good carpenter?" Yeah. Maybe his friends came up to him and said, "Well, it's a good thing that Messiah worked out, because man, he built a shed for me." Broke down a year afterwards. And it makes kind of a funny joke if you don't mind being scared out of your wits at laughing at something like that. But the point I'm making is, do you think Joseph and Jesus were good good carpenters? I gotta believe they were. Particularly Jesus, but I gotta believe Joseph was too. You think he came when he said he was going to come? Well, see him Monday at 9. You think he showed up Monday at 9? You think he held to his bid? It's going to cost this amount of money. It's going to take this much time.
I would let him serve that. But that's my thinking. An unrighteous man would not have fit that role. Why did it have to fit somebody who's white? Joseph was a righteous man in himself. He would have had to, because God would.
Exactly. And my point being that here we have very righteous man in Joseph, and yet he doesn't have a whole lot of money. And I certainly wouldn't put Joseph in the category of, well, this guy's his own worst enemy. Most of the charity cases I know, generally speaking, if you interview them long enough, they got some things to look at. I don't think you could say that about Joseph. And yet, here he is. All we've got is turtle doves. Yeah, Joe? Yeah, from probably Persia, Babylon area, something like that. Did I miss something? Were you telling a joke?
No.
Oh, okay.
I said they were firemen.
Oh, firemen. I thought you said they were farmers. Okay. I was just going to let that one go in one ear and out the other. But anyways, yes, they offer 2 turtle doves. So Mary and Joseph were not exactly wealthy. And I got to believe, I heard it, and this is the kind of thing I'm getting at. I heard a radio program one day, and the host had an author on, and the author, or he was leading a movement, and his movement was he wanted to demand in America that your boss could not make you work over 40 hours a week if you didn't want to. The host of the program is one of these guys who thinks if you're awake, you should be working. One of these guys who's a proud workaholic. You ever noticed how you call somebody an alcoholic? So, I'm sorry. Call somebody a workaholic, and I want to be like him. No, you don't. And that was the point the host was making. I mean, the guest was making. The guest was making this point. There's more to life than work. A well-rounded human being spends time on a lot of areas in life. And by the time your work has gotten 40 hours out of you, they should not be allowed to demand any more than that. I've got other things to do. Well, the host wasn't having any of it. The host was like, I work 60 hours a week and then I go to bed. Blah. He's one of those guys. Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, and the harder you work, the more successful you are in life. And he was not even open to the point the guy was making, which is there's more to life than making money. I don't think you could make any argument other than Joseph and Mary were righteous people. And yet here they are offering turtle doves. We'll pick it up chapter 13. After we take 15-minute break. 15-minute break, guys. See you about 7:35. It's amazing how sometimes people ask questions you'd never thought of it before, and I hadn't thought of it. I went looking for it, and apparently not too many other people have thought of it either, because I couldn't find an answer very easily, but I did get one answer, which is, what did they do with the priestly garments? They got, stained with blood. Well, were they washing them nonstop, that kind of thing? And the answer is no, they never washed them. They actually would use them until they pronounced them unusable anymore. And I don't really know exactly at what point that would happen, but they would store them away and start over again with another garment. But yeah, they did not wash them. But yeah, excellent question, Carl. And apparently no one else has thought of that question either, because I keep reading and reading. I'm like, I answer every question under the sun except for that one. But I wish I could remember who it was. If I can remember, I'll let you know. But yeah, they did not wash them. And by the way, they have like 500 priests working at the same time. 2.5 million people would be in town for these festivals. The activity at the temple on feast days was incredible. The speed and the organization with which they were cranking out sacrifices and blood. It was a machine. They had it down to a science. So anyways, the laws of childbirth in chapter 12, chapter 13 and 14. Laws of leprosy. What kinds of leprosy do we deal with? Leprosy of the skin, leprosy of clothing. And did you know houses could get leprosy? Yes. And in chapters 13 and 14, the laws of leprosy are being the priest, how he would examine the people. A priest would examine people to see if they possessed leprosy or not, announcing that they would be clean or unclean. Is leprosy necessarily a sinful condition?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily, but it gets associated with sinfulness pretty quickly for a couple of reasons. Number one, ain't too many good stories in the scriptures of anything good happening when someone broke out with leprosy, is it? Wasn't Miriam, a leper? God struck her with leprosy as punishment. Who knows who Uzziah is? He's also known as Azariah, he has two names. He was the king on the throne in the year that he died, in the year that Isaiah was raised up. Isaiah chapter 6, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high on his throne, high and lifted up. The train of his robe filled the temple. Seraphim were there saying, holy, 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 the Lord our God is holy, which I'm sure is undoubtedly where the song Holy, Holy, Holy comes from, Isaiah chapter 6. That happened in the days of Uzziah. He was king for 52 years. By the way, I always find that fascinating. Was Uzziah a good king or an evil king? He's a good king. If you got a king on the throne for 52 years and he dies, you think people get nervous about the future? Oh man, he was a great king. What are we going to have now? Isn't it interesting? In the year that a great king dies, God calls Isaiah to his prophetic office. God doesn't, nobody slips between the cracks with God. He rose up Isaiah at a great time. But anyways, what was Uzziah, not Isaiah, but Uzziah, King Uzziah, what was his one great sin? Anybody remember? Went into the temple and offered sacrifice on the, went into the holy place and offered incense on the altar of incense. Problem is, he's not a Levite. And when the priest confronted him, he was unrepentant until leprosy broke out on him. And then he ended up dwelling in his own house, isolated from the community the rest of his life. One of the reasons why dating can be so difficult in the Old Testament, dating king's reigns, is because of how often a father and son's reign would overlap. And, you know, here's a perfect example. Uzziah was still king, but he had to live in an isolated house, and his son Jotham had to actually perform the duties of a king because Uzziah was isolated from the rest of the community. So you've got Miriam, you've got Uzziah, and then Jeroboam. Anybody remember who Jeroboam is? 1 Kings chapter 12. He instituted the false worship, put a golden calf in Bethel and Dan, and he's officiating at the altar in Bethel. And the man of God in 1 Kings 13 approaches him and condemns his religious practice. He stretches out his hand and says, "Arrest him." And his hand withers up and is leprous. Didn't Moses have some leprosy too? Well, actually, I shouldn't use that one because that's a different example. True, but yeah, but not the purpose I was driving at. The purpose I was driving at is quite often leprosy is associated with people who are in the middle of sin when they were struck with it. So there's a natural correlation between leprosy and sinfulness. Naaman was a leper, but he was absolutely, and you know, that's one of the things you learn when you read this chapter. I'm not going to read it verse by verse, but when we read these chapters, one of the things that's clear is there were different levels and different levels of, what's the term when you, contamination. Not everyone was contaminated and able to transfer it to others, which is why you had people like Naaman who could actually function in society and mix it up with people because he wasn't what's the word I'm looking for? Contagious. Thank you. All around it, but I couldn't say it. He wasn't contagious. So depending on your level of sickness, whether it was contamination was possible or not. Contagious. That's it. What's that? Syrian general. Yeah. And what was his problem? He didn't like the Jordan River. 7 times. Yeah. You know how to interpret that in New Testament times, don't you? I mean, truth can't be in that one-room schoolhouse. Come on, it's got to be in this glorious palace over here. I had a guy in Alachua. I'm not sure if we had met you by then, but he said this to me one time. You know, of course, when I was preaching in Alachua, Katrina and Daniel and a lot of other students were at the University of Florida. And we'd get them to come out and play basketball with us on Sunday night once in a while. And a guy named Ryan, and he was from a Baptist church in Orlando, 5,000 member Baptist church in Orlando. Ascend the marble staircase to the golden altar, you know, that kind of building. Well, Katrina knows what the Alachua Church of Christ is like. It's it's a small, humble building in the middle of a neighborhood. You don't stumble across the Alachua Church of Christ by accident. Somebody has to invite you back there because you don't, it's not on a main road. Small building. Well, I extended the invitation, and of course, I emphasized baptism, knowing where he was from. And then we went over to my house afterwards to get dressed to go play basketball. There was a basketball rec center right around the corner. That was one of the lures we would get people. Hey, come on out, we'll play basketball after the evening worship. And we would get a few people every now and then, got him. And I could tell when I was extending the invitation, he was not happy because I was hammering on baptism. And I got to my house and he came over to change to get ready for basketball. And you could tell he was still bothered, but he didn't know what to say. I said, "Brian, anything wrong?" And he said, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's pretty close to what he said, even though it was several years ago. He said, I went to a 5,000 member congregation in Orlando. He said, I got saved years ago. He said, I can find it hard to believe, but if I hadn't found this, and he trying not to be rude, but you know, if I hadn't found this little church, that if I had died, I'd be lost. And of course, my response to him was, well, how do you know that this isn't God trying to help you with what you need to hear? And then I wrote down, the last time I saw him, I wrote down every passage in the New Testament that occurred to me off the top of my head, based on Mark 16:16, what saves us? Based on Acts 2:38, what gives us remission of sin? Based on Acts 22:16, what washes away sin? Just handed him a list. I said, take a look at that list and get back to me when you want to talk about it. And I never heard from him again. But of course, the point of my story is, in Orlando, he went to a cathedral. In Alachua, he was coming to our one-room schoolhouse, if you will, and to him, he just couldn't believe that this could be what he has to listen to, as opposed to the grandeur of his church in Orlando. It's a big hurdle for some people, unfortunately. The simplicity of the gospel message is lost on people from time to time, unfortunately. I'm not even sure how we got to talking about that, but anyways, talking about lepers. Of course, the priest would conduct an examination in chapter 13 to see what kind of leprosy you had and what ought to have been done about it, which would tell you that the priest would become really good and efficient at examining leprosy. And you would have to examine it closely because it looked like some other things that weren't necessarily contagious or a problem. So the priest would have to determine whether or not you were actually leprous, in which case, if you were, then you would have to be isolated from the community. And we all know, what would you have to say if you were a leper and somebody was approaching you? Chapter 13, verse 45 and 46. Now the leper on whom the sore is, his clothes shall be torn and his head bare, and he shall cover his mustache and cry, unclean, unclean. He shall be unclean. All the days he has the sore, he shall be unclean. He is unclean, and he shall dwell alone. His habitation shall be outside the camp. And so obviously, too many things more hideous than what leprosy in its worst forms can do to you, literally deform you. And also the fact that you're isolated from the community, living out with other lepers all by yourself. And obviously you can, it doesn't take much of an imagination to figure out how bad you must feel about yourself in a situation like this. Anybody remember the days of acne? And I'm serious, you know, we tend to make jokes of it as you get a little older and you're not dealing with it anymore, but there's nothing funny about it when it's happening to you. Nothing funny about it at all. And anytime your face is disfigured like that, you know, what that's going to do to your self-esteem is a miserable situation. And so, yes.
With Ted, they go visit leprous colonies. They live out
Mhm.
from the people, and they have a lot of them have lost fingers and toes.
Yeah.
And things like that.
Yeah, it is a vicious disease and parts literally drop off sometimes. Yeah, it's vicious. Not all forms are that bad. Are these people isolated from the community?
Yeah, they are.
All of them?
But I don't know. I mean, it's treatable now, so I don't
Right.
know what. I don't know if they don't have access. You know, they might have. It's on us, so they may not have the access.
Well, and one of the reasons that leprosy is so bad there is because a certain kind of climate attracts it. Historians used to call it the baker's itch. You know what that meant? People that lived in that kind of climate, operating the furnaces with the dust and the dry air and the extreme heat, they were creating conditions that just seemed to be right for leprosy to break out. And so in this part of the world, and of course the medical community being what it was 2,000 years ago, you know, this was a big problem, particularly in any desert type climate, and particularly for those that work around things like that. Anybody, by the way, does anybody know where the Mad Hatter idea comes from? Why don't we 19th century, people that worked, that made hats, they were all insane. That's where Mad Hatter comes from. You know why they were insane? So they were using mercury, and they didn't know how bad mercury was for you. Anybody know who Ellen G. White is? The founder of the, not founder, but the prophetess, if you will, of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Her father was a hatter, and if I'm not mistaken, he had that problem. There was just something, no matter what town you went to, if you found the hatter in town, something wrong with that guy. Elevator's not going all the way up. Well, yeah, it's not, because he's on mercury. He doesn't even know it. Yeah, Damien?
Margaret has her hand raised again.
Yes, Margaret.
Yes, in Matthew 8, when Jesus healed the leper,
Right.
because they were so that he told him not to speak to anyone till he had gone to the priest and had the priest declare him clean, declare him, be examined, I should say. He had to be examined. And Jesus knew that people wouldn't accept it unless the priest had examined him and said he really was healed.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's exactly why Jesus, of course, always keeping the law of Moses, commanded that the lepers go up and be pronounced clean, because you weren't clean until you were pronounced clean so that you could be restored back to the community. They had an interesting cleansing process as well. Look at, I thought I had it written down. Verse 14.
Yeah.
Yeah, look at chapter 14, verse 14. Did you have anything else, Margaret?
No, that's all.
Oh, well, thank you. That's very insightful. Chapter 14, verse 14. The priest shall take some of the blood of the trespass offering, and the priest shall put it on the tip of his right ear of him who is to be cleansed, on his thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. Now, where did we see that before? Consecration of the priest in Leviticus chapter 8. What does the ear represent? Why the ear, the thumb, and the toe? I imagine if you could put blood in the eyes would have been included too, but you can't obviously rub blood in the eyes, but the symbolism is the same. What you hear, what you do, where you walk, how your walk is, should be consecrated with blood. Verse 15, the priest shall take some of the log of oil and pour it into the palm of his own left hand. Then the priest shall dip his right finger in the oil that is left hand, and shall sprinkle some of the oil with his finger 7 times before the Lord. And of the rest of the oil in his hand, the priest shall put some of the tip, some on the tip of the right ear of him who is to be cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, on his big toe of his right foot, on the blood of the trespass offering. Hang on, I was looking for something here. I thought I wrote it down and I didn't, so I'm looking for it. It's right here, though. Where's it at? Where's it at with the 2 turtle doves?
It's 13, 12, 13.
Yeah, I was trying to see the actual process of them dipping the one in the, they would kill one of the birds and the blood would drain out. They would dip the other bird in the blood and water mixture. And then they would release the live bird after they killed the dead one. And the live bird, of course, would fly away. Yeah, anyways, I was just, I thought I wrote it down and I didn't, but it's right here in these chapters, chapter 13 and 14. Most likely 14 should describe exactly. Yeah, I can't believe I'm missing it. Should be right here. Thought I had it highlighted and I don't see it.
Verse 1:5.
Yeah, there it is. No, it's right at the beginning of the chapter. No wonder I jumped past it. Look at verse 4. Chapter 14, verse 4. Then the priest shall command to take for him who is to be cleansed 2 living and clean birds, cedar wood, scarlet, and hyssop. They tie the cedar wood and the hyssop together with that scarlet thread. And the priest shall command that one of the birds be killed in an earthen vessel over running water. And as the living bird, he shall take the cedar wood and the scarlet and the hyssop, dip them, and the living bird in the blood of the bird that was killed over the running water. And he shall sprinkle it 7 times on him who is to be cleansed from the leprosy, and shall pronounce him clean, and shall let the living bird loose in the open field. That's the sacrifice that you offer. What do you think the symbolism is all about in that one?
You got to be washed in the blood. You have to
There
be
you go.
washed in the blood.
Mixture of blood and water. What happened when Jesus was stabbed in the side on the cross? What came out? Blood and water. Notice the bird is still alive and he is flying away. Notice that the water is being poured. Living water, water that flows. What did Jesus say about his water? It's living water. You drink the water he gives you, you'll never thirst again. You can see some of the symbolism in here. And by the way, these chapters came up big in my neck of the woods when COVID first hit. People trying to figure out, should we assemble? Shouldn't we assemble? You know, governors telling us not to, Washington telling us not to. And what should we do? A lot of people ran to this chapter for their defense. So we had one person in the congregation say, well, you had to be pronounced with leprosy before you were isolated from the community. Of course, my response to that is, March of 2020, where's the line between the clean and the unclean? You know, unfortunately, I thought it was kind of I understood what the person was trying to do, but I didn't think it was a very useful comparison, because in Leviticus and also in the days of Jesus, you have a clean community, you have a leper colony. If the priest pronounces that you have leprosy and you need to be isolated, where do you go? You go to the leper colony. If your leprosy gets better, you're no longer contagious and it's going away, what do? You come to the priest. If the priest sees that you are clean, we perform this sacrifice right here, and you are restored back to the community. The problem we had in 2020 was, there's the clean and unclean community. There is no line. You can't say somebody is clean or somebody is unclean just by looking at them. There's no examination. So it became, a tricky issue for a lot of people. But anyways, I just brought that up in the sense that I wouldn't be using that as an illustration, because, in these days we've got a clean community, we've got an unclean community. And with the priestly examination, we can tell which community you are a part of. But anyways, clean and the unclean, leprosy. And obviously, in what way does leprosy represent sin? Well, again, I'm not going to read the chapter, but if you read chapter 13, it describes what the priest is looking for. And guess what you notice? One of the worst things that can happen is open, sore flesh. And what you will notice is that there is some leprosy that just seems to be on the skin. It's contagious and we've got to isolate you, but it isn't quite as bad. There's other leprosy where you have live flesh staring you in the face. Sin's gotten in a little deeper. What happens when we start with sin? By the way, this famous story for a lot of people. What happens no matter how much you try to tell a teenager not to drink, they go out and drink. And you know what happens a lot of times? Nothing happened. I don't know why mom and dad got so excited. I actually had a good time. In fact, nobody's looking. I'm going to do it again next weekend. That was fun. I thought, if I cracked the beer, that I'd explode. It turns out I had a good time. Yeah. 5 years from now, what happened now? Hey, Mike, you want to go to the restaurant? Sorry, I can't drive. Got DUI. I took my license away from me. Keep drinking another 5 years, what happens? My health is broken down. Now I'm, in the hospital or whatever. You know what I mean? There's that progression in life. Sin does that to you. What did James say? That we are led away by our own desires and enticed. What comes after that? When sin is full grown, what happens? Brings forth death. Doesn't start out that way. It's a progression. And by the way, I think that's one of the things that people miss. One of the great passages in Revelation chapter 22. What does it mean? He who is holy, let him be holy still. He who is righteous, let him be righteous still. He who is unholy, let him be unholy still. Anybody remember that passage? What's he getting at in that passage? Anybody watch Warner Bros? You're growing up Saturday morning, 10 to 12? Yeah, that's what I watched after on Saturdays after school of preaching. That was my relaxation day. Saturday morning, homework and Bugs Bunny. Have you ever seen that commercial or that cartoon where Sylvester uses all 9 lives trying to kill Tweety? And the cartoon ends where all 9 of Sylvester's lives have been spent. And of course, you know, he's getting ready to attack him to eat him when he's jumping on him, and then he blows up or whatever. And the last scene shows 9 different Sylvesters on clouds singing the angelic chorus as they go up to heaven. Now, of course, that makes me laugh, and obviously it makes you guys chuckle too. But let's get serious for a moment. Where do they come up with ideas like that? Well, they got wings. Where do they come up with ideas like that? We think somehow that all the things we didn't like about this life, all things we didn't like about godliness, I should say, suddenly become appealing to us. I hate singing spiritual songs. Now I want to be in the front of the chorus. Now, what if when you die, you're exactly who you were in life? You were unrighteous in life, let him be unrighteous still. There's this illusion for a lot of people that when we die, the part of the change that happens in the moment, in the twinkling of an eye, we shall all be changed. But that doesn't mean we're given a character that we haven't been working on in life. You are who you are. Sylvester, you remember you were attacking? That's what you look like now. And, you know, by the way, that's one of the things I like to point out to people when I'm talking to them about drinking. Anybody? One of the great tortures of a life of drinking is the phenomenon of craving. You know what that means? That means even though I know there is no earthly reason, I can't think of one good reason why I should drink, but I want to anyways. And I'm going to. The phenomenon of craving. What happens if you die and the phenomenon of craving is still with you? Anybody want to go through a lifetime, or I mean an eternity, with that monkey on your back? Because there are a lot of people that think just the opposite. Okay, yeah, he had craving for liquor all of his life. Suddenly he died, and now his craving for liquor is gone. Well, what if your craving for liquor is still there? There's just no way to quench it anymore. You are who you are when you die. The choices we make in life changes your character towards godliness or towards ungodliness. We are changing our character with the decisions we make, which is why, in keeping with the book of Leviticus, what's holy and clean, what's unclean and unholy. We have to make those distinctions because our character is changing. We are either becoming more godlike or we're not. And we need to take a good look at that because there's no magic on the day of resurrection. All the things that didn't appeal to you in this life are suddenly going to appeal to you. And all the things that you were chasing after in this life suddenly aren't going to be appealing anymore. I don't think it works that way. But anyways, chapter 13 and 14, of course, devoted to leprosy. And that is the procedure to have you restored back to the community. But of course, we know what a miserable condition that would be. And by the way, remember, who's the first audience? It's the Jews in the wilderness, right? Where's your neighbor? And right here. Where's your neighbor on the other side? It's right here. I can touch his tent from here. 2.5 million people living on top of each other. You want your next door neighbor to have leprosy? That isn't even any good in a city situation with a lot of But in the wilderness, you got 2.5 million people living shoulder to shoulder. You get leprosy, we're going to have to do something about it. So it had immediate need while they were camped in the wilderness. Chapter 14 ends, this is the law, verse 54. This is the law for any leprous sore and skull, for the leprosy of a garment and of a house, for the swelling and scab of a bright spot, to each when it is unclean and when it is clean. This is the law of leprosy. Of course, we kind of skipped over what happened to clothing. Sometimes clothing could be saved if you just washed it, depending on what leprosy was. Sometimes you just have to get rid of the garment. Sometimes they would just cut out the part of the garment that was leprous. What happened if you got leprosy in the house? Depended. You had to have the priest come in and take a look at it. Sometimes you just needed to replace a few stones in the house, scrape a few other stones clean, and sometimes you need a new house. Depends on how bad it was. Now, obviously, they call it leprosy, but we got to believe it's something more like mold or some kind of things that destroy houses in our day and time. But same thing, you had to have the priest come in and take a look at it. Hopefully your house could be saved, but you might actually need to have a new house depending on how serious the leprosy is. But by the way, when again, because I'm trying to always remember that these things are pointing towards the New Testament. Right next to verse 15, I've got Hebrews 5:12 written down next to it. Turn to Hebrews 5:12, will you? The Hebrew writer in Hebrews 5, it wants to talk about the priesthood of Melchizedek. But the congregation is just not ready to hear about Melchizedek because they're still babes in Christ, which is why he says, look at verse 9, Hebrews 5:9. And having been perfected, he became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him, called by God as high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. Now, if he doesn't go off on this tangent, he would just start teaching what's in chapter 7, because that's where he takes up the subject of Melchizedek. But instead, he says this, of whom we have much to say and hard to explain, since you have become dull of hearing. For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God, and you have come to need milk and not solid food. For everyone who partakes of only milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. But solid food belongs to those who are full age, that is, those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. Now, before I make the point I'm actually here for, let me make one more point, because I think it's important to today's church. Now, notice what's the complaint right there. You guys aren't very good Bible students. And I find myself having to teach you elementary principles when in reality, you ought to be teaching other people some of these things. That's his complaint, right? Look at chapter 6, drop down to verse 9. Now, it's the same context. He's made some warnings to them about turning back, but he says this in verse 9. But, beloved, we are confident of better things concerning you, yes, things that accompany salvation, though we speak in this manner. For God is not unjust to forget your work of labor and labor of love, which you have shown towards his name, in that you have ministered to the saints and do minister. Now, you know why I like to include 9 and 10 in my study right there? What's the picture he has just painted of the church? And by the way, this is the Jerusalem church, 25 years after it was founded. Now, stop and think about that for a minute. This is the mother church, for just to use that term, but this is where it all started. The church in Jerusalem. 25 years later, what does the Hebrew writer say about the church in Jerusalem? Man, we need some teachers around here. We got some babes. Anybody teach this class? That's his complaint. But notice what he commends them for. Verses 9 and 10. I believe Paul wrote the Hebrew letter. It's not important, but I think he did write it. But let's just call it Paul for a second. Paul is complimenting them on the fact that when your brethren needed help, you were there for them. And God's not going to forget that. Now put those two passages together, and what do you get? You know what I get? The church of the 21st century. Do you know how many people I've met in 25 years give you the shirt off their back? They'd do anything for you, except teach next Sunday morning's class. That ain't happening. Of course, I'm exaggerating to be silly, but you get my main point. I have met a lot of people in the church that are okay with, I'm just going to fill my life up with good works, and I'm not really that concerned about being a good Bible student. I know the basics, and I know how to minister to my brethren, and that's going to be good enough. Well, what's the apostle telling us here? That's not how we ought to look at it. And why is that important? Because again, we go back to what's clean and unclean. The key verse in Hebrews chapter 5, verse 12 or 14, who have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. Now, how's that connected to the book of Leviticus? What are we doing all day long? We're making choices about what's clean and what's unclean. What is that supposed to help us with? It's supposed to help us in life to determine some things are clean, some things are unclean. You have to be able to discern between good and evil. And by the way, how does that work? Anybody met anyone else in the church that thinks homosexuals were born that way? And thinks they're an isolated class of people? And I'll go ahead and go back to Leviticus now. We'll jump ahead just for a moment since I brought the subject up, but look at Leviticus 18. Leviticus 18, verse 22. In chapter 18, he gets into the law of sexual sins. And in chapter 18, verse 22, he says this: "You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination." You probably have a reference, as I do, to chapter 20 and verse 13. Chapter 20 and verse 13 says, "If a man lies with a male, as he lies with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They surely shall be put to death. Their blood shall be upon them." Don't blame it on anyone that killed them. They're the reason they're dead. But those two passages are pretty, let's put it this way. Does God tell you what he thinks about homosexuality in these passages? Calls it an abomination. Does he tell you what he thinks it's worth? Man, it's worth death penalty. We do not live in a world that wants to hear that message these days. And by the way, they want to isolate the homosexual community. And this is what I mean. Be careful of people who isolate for the purposes of divide and conquer. The homosexual community is not being persecuted in any unfair way as far as Christians are concerned. And here's what I mean by this. Didn't Paul say in 1 Corinthians, the homosexuals will not inherit the kingdom of God? He said that, didn't he?
6:9.
Thank you. 1 Corinthians 6:9. And such were some of you. But still, he said homosexuals will not inherit the kingdom of God. Anybody else on that list?
Fornicators, idolaters.
Thank you. Particularly, and there's more, but the ones I'm interested in is adulterers and fornicators. Because here's what I mean about discerning good and evil. Built into the argument, people are born that way. Do you realize what's assumed by that argument? What's assumed by that argument is if you have the desire, it should be legitimate. Well, wait a minute now. Let's walk through that one. First of all, number one, married people and single people are also on that list. Adulterers means you were married. Fornicators means you were single and engaged in sexual activity. Well, I can speak to this topic firsthand because I didn't get married till I was 37, and then I didn't find Nick till I was 49. I know a little something about lonely. And you know what I know? I had desire I wasn't supposed to act on. I had moments in my life where I could have looked the wrong way, and there was only one thing keeping me from doing it, and that was, it's not right. Yeah. I know what God's word says about fornication. I'm single, but I have a desire. I'm not supposed to act on it, right? I hate to say it because it's an uncomfortable subject, but there is such a thing as a married person being tempted by someone else. And if they're being honest with themselves, they may have to say, yes, in all honesty, I am tempted in this situation. But what's the right thing to do? You remove yourself from it, whatever it takes. If I can't ever talk to that person again because we're going to get into trouble, then that's what it takes. May have to block them on Facebook, whatever it is. But because I'm married, that's leading to adultery, and I have to stop that. What does that mean? Yeah, I might have some desire, but I have to say no. I'm a single man. I may have some desire, but I have to say no. I have desire for somebody from the same sex. I have to say no. You're still making a choice. And you're not making a choice that's different from anybody else. Does everybody realize the homosexual community is actually fishing from the same pond you and I are fishing from? We're all in this together. Who are we allowed to marry? Somebody from the opposite sex that is scripturally able to marry. That applies to the homosexual too. Well, that's not fair, Mike. You get to have your desire. I don't. And my answer to that is, ask Nick if she got the desire of her heart. And she got stuck with me. Now, my only point, and again, I'm being silly, but my point is, everybody doesn't get the desire of their heart. You're not alone in this world because your desire didn't get fulfilled. The world's full of people who had desires that didn't get fulfilled. And sometimes, most importantly, they weren't fulfilled because they knew their desires were against God's word. Here's one of the things that the world needs to get in touch with. And by the way, this may actually be a chapter in my book. I'm thinking about having a chapter in my book just titled Sex. For the amount of people who are going to throw their soul away for no other reason than sex. I'm willing to do anything you ask me to do except curb my sex life. That's not happening. And that's the way some people behave. And that's one of the reasons I feel compelled to write a book to point some of these things out. Because there are some people, that's the one area in their life they're not going to let you touch. You can talk to them about anything else that's going on in their life. They're willing to listen to you and may even repent. They can see the need, but that area, leave me alone. And do you know where that idea is born from? If I have the desire, I ought to be able to act on it. Well, no, it's not how it works. There's the same cure for everybody as far as sexual gratification. Somebody from the opposite sex. Does somebody have a question? Yes, ma'am. Is that
That's
Margaret
me.
again?
That's Margaret,
Yes,
yeah.
Margaret.
I was just going to say, you know that in homosexual relationships, that if one of them cheats on the other one, then they consider that wrong. You weren't supposed to act on that. The fact that you met somebody else, you aren't supposed to act on that because we're in a relationship, and now that they allow married, you'd have married couples that would say, homosexuals, you can't react on that, but yet they can react on their desire to be homosexual.
I'm glad you said that because I was going to mention it and then forgot to. But yeah, just to kind of finish off that thought. The other thing that's kind of ironic is, what is a homosexual basically saying to God? Basically, they're saying, I don't want the restrictions that your law places on my sexual behavior. But then what do they turn right around and do? They place restrictions on people's sexual behavior. God can't do it. God forbid somebody should try to limit my sexual behavior, but I have no problem asking you to do it. Well, wait a minute. If the desire should give license to the activity, then why should you be making commitments to each other to limit your sex? How come it's okay for you to limit your sexual behavior and it not be judgmental, but God doing it, something's wrong with it? Yes, sir. Margaret again? Oh, okay.
It's loosely based on God.
Yeah.
Loosely based.
Yeah. And the point being that intimate activity has a way of being as intimate as it seems like it is. And what do I mean by that? I mean, anybody in his right mind knows it is behavior that should be shared between a husband and wife, because when a husband and a wife commits adultery, it breaks the other one's heart. They have to live with that for the rest of their life. Nothing is as painful as that. And stop to think about it, of all the things that husbands and wives do to each other, was God's answer? Hang in there and work it out. Except if they cheat on you. And you don't have to hang in there for that. How much pain does that suggest when even God says, no, that's the one thing you don't have to put up with? You put up with a lot of things in marriage sometimes. But you don't have to put up with that. You can walk away from that. That's how much pain is involved. But anyways, discerning good and evil. People aren't born with sexual preferences. They learn those. And by the way, I got humbled one time with Leviticus 18 and 20. I have a niece who has a transsexual child. And it has caused her, even though I baptized her into Christ, it has caused her to wander far from God's plan. But one of the things that amazed me, and it almost, didn't almost, it really humbled me. I kind of assumed people knew that the Bible said homosexuality was wrong. She'd never heard this before. She didn't know Leviticus 18:22 says what it says, or Leviticus 20, verse 13. I kind of assumed she did. And here's what's interesting. Do you know who read it to her? A homosexual who repented because he loves God more than he loves sexual activity. And so he realized that my homosexual tendencies are going to cost me my soul. He actually repented of it. And so he lives a single life because he's not interested in getting married. Now, he's not a member of the Lord's church, but he's faithful to the church that he attends. But he's the one that showed her these passages. And I'm thinking to myself, man, don't make assumptions. I just assumed she knew those were in there. And it wasn't until she actually read them with her own eyes that she realized, oh, I didn't know the Bible said that. But here's the other thing that I thought was interesting. When her child was born a male and is now presents themselves to the world as a female, when they were making that decision, my niece supported her. But do you know what her argument to me was for 2 years straight? That's not a boy. That's a girl. I don't care what you think, and I don't care what biology says. That's a girl. Then my friend reads her these passages. You know what her next problem for me was, or her next dilemma she called me about? She said, well, when she gets older, because they call her she, when she gets older and she starts having intimacy, she's going to be intimate with guys. But what about homosexuality? You know what I said to her at that point? I said, you just spent the last 2 years trying to convince me that that child's a girl. Well, if that child's a girl and they're being intimate with a boy, then there's nothing homosexual there. Even you don't believe it. And that's what's kind of sad about the world we live in. Man, I had this girl screaming at me for 2 years that I was being judgmental and didn't understand that you're really dealing with a girl here and you're just not sensitive enough. And yet, even in her heart of hearts, she knows that's homosexual behavior. If you really believe that's a girl, that's not homosexual behavior. Apparently, even you don't believe it. It's kind of sad, the world we live in, because people don't exercise their senses to discern good and evil. We get lost in the gray areas quite often. But anyways, that's chapter 18. What time is it? 8:27. Let's at least notice chapter 15. This is an uncomfortable chapter too, because it's dealing with discharges from the human body, discharges of sexual organs. The basic rule basically in chapter 15 is that normal discharges require bathing, while abnormal ones require separation and sacrifice. There are some discharges that what we would consider normal. I'll let you read the chapter to see. You may have to bathe, you may have to wash clothes, and you may be unclean till sundown. But there are other discharges that are abnormal. Of course, the Bible gives a woman basically a week for her monthly, when her time is upon her. Doesn't usually take that long, but the Bible gives them a week. But it may be longer than that. And if that's the case, there may be something more that needs to be done about it. But that is the basic rule. There was one passage that I really wanted to notice. Look at verse 18, chapter 15, verse 18. Also, when a woman lies with a man and there is an emission of semen, they shall bathe in water and shall be unclean until evening. Okay, I just wanted to read one more passage before I thought. One of the reasons why that gets my attention is for this reason: unclean till evening. What was one of the things that would keep you from assembling with the church or with the Old Testament with the Jews for the feasts? You couldn't be ceremonially unclean. What does that tell you about a feast day? And a husband and wife who love each other very much and are very affectionate towards one another. Yeah, well, be careful. And what I'm trying to emphasize here is notice that serving God always takes precedence. You know, a young couple that gets married that are enjoying the privileges of marriage, yet tomorrow's the feast day. Well, you wake up tomorrow and, hey, honey, I got a couple hours to kill. How about you? Wouldn't want to be unclean. And the point I'm trying to make is that as honorable as the marriage bed is, obviously serving God takes precedence. You're unclean even in a natural situation, something that a husband and wife can be expected to do and should do with regularity, because that's part of what Paul meant about giving your spouse their due. But by the same token, you also want to recognize that that would leave you ceremonially unclean for a day. And if you've got to make an appearance at the temple or the tabernacle, you might want to think about that. Let's read one more passage, and we'll pick it up at the Day of Atonement next week. Look at verse 24. If any man lies with her at all, so that her impurity is on him, he shall be unclean 7 days, and every bed on which he lies shall be unclean. And the one rule that comes across in this is that everything that you touch, if a man is pronounced unclean, the bed he's laying on is unclean. The chair that he sits on is unclean. Same with the woman. Anytime the uncleanness is coming from the sexual organ, if you will, the things you touch are also unclean. And the reason why I read that passage is because if you look at Leviticus 18:19 and 20:18, you will see that a man should not be lying with a woman if her time is upon her. And yet in this passage, it is suggested that they might do that. And the only thing that I can think of is they are probably saying that there is such a time when you may not realize it till it's too late. You can become accidentally unclean. But was chapter 18, verse 19 said, also, you shall not approach a woman to uncover her nakedness as long as she's in her customary impurity. Well, they almost seem to contradict, if you see what I mean. And the only way I can harmonize that is such a thing as not realizing until after the fact. Incidental contact, you didn't realize it, but now it's too late. You're still unclean, and you'll be unclean for 7 days. But it must have been an accident, because if you had known, then you shouldn't have approached her. Yes, sir.
Rachel, she did her father's idol up under her. She sat upon it. When the question she said, how about we give her a woman? A woman, it's her time to love. So he back away. Okay, I'm not going to search right there.
I had never even thought of that story, but great time to bring that story up. Everybody heard that? Rachel, in what chapter is that? Like 29, something like that? Yeah, I can't remember exactly. But in the book of Genesis, Rachel stole her father's idol. She sat on it and then claimed it was a time of the month. And of course, he immediately backed up because she's unclean. And so you have to leave her alone in a situation like that. But anyways, those laws of clean and unclean, I think ultimately for the Christian, should help us to see about our choices. And the choices we are making day in and day out can be categorized as clean or unclean, and we all know what we should be choosing. We'll pick it up at the Day of Atonement next week. We got to get moving a little bit faster. I talk too much. I appreciate you coming out. Appreciate you being online as well. Carl, I've been calling you all night by your name, and all of a sudden when I wanted it, I couldn't remember it. Would you like to dismiss?